Harper had always been a quiet student, 13 years old, calm demeanor, good grades, and a bracelet on her wrist crafted by the veteran father she deeply admired. But something in the classroom began to shift, an eerie silence. Public reprimands masked as lessons. Gradually, she stopped raising her hand, stopped smiling, stopped believing in herself, until the day everything shattered with a pair of scissors. What happened next shocked the entire school and unveiled a truth no one had dared to confront. This is the story of a girl humiliated in front of everyone, and a father who refused to let silence win. If this story has already touched your heart just from the beginning, imagine what comes next. Like the video, leave your comment. We want to know how you feel. And if real transformative stories like this move you, subscribe to the channel. Because here, every story has the power to awaken something within us. Since the beginning of the semester, Harper had noticed something different about how she was being treated in class. It was as if a specific kind of silence enveloped her whenever the teacher walked by. A silence so heavy it spoke louder than any shouted reprimand. At 13, Harper wasn't the type of student who drew attention. She was quiet, polite, focused, always eager to learn. But even without fully understanding why, she felt that in the teacher's eyes, something about her was unsettling. Something that triggered subtle yet constant reactions that gradually became burdensome. That morning, like so many others, the classroom atmosphere felt heavy from the very start. Students entered silently, each taking their usual seat, while the teacher, with her rigid demeanor and ever-watchful eyes, walked to her desk without exchanging words. Her tone as she began the lesson was firm and direct, devoid of any kindness. She instructed everyone to open their books to a specific page and commenced reading with unyielding punctuality, as if every second of class was part of a precise mechanism that couldn't afford delays. Harper sat near the window, a spot she had chosen for its natural light and the occasional solace she found in watching the trees sway outside. It was a quiet corner of the room, helping her maintain focus. As she followed along with the reading, she tried to concentrate on the content, but when her pencil slipped off her desk and hit the floor, everything around her seemed to freeze for a moment. The teacher stopped reading. The silence deepened. Then she turned and asked, in a curt manner, if there was any reason for such an early distraction. Caught off guard, Harper simply explained that she had dropped her pencil, but she could tell from the teacher's gaze that the explanation didn't matter. The woman resumed reading as if that brief exchange was sufficient, but the discomfort lingered in the air, hovering among classmates who, as usual, pretended not to notice. This kind of interaction was no longer new. Harper had been accumulating small incidents that seemed isolated, but when recalled in sequence, formed a pattern hard to ignore. It was always her who faced stricter enforcement of school rules. Only she was reprimanded for a misplaced stitch on her uniform. Only she received harsher critiques on assignments, even when they were correct. And when she answered questions in class, answers that were usually right, she received surprised looks from the teacher, as if competence was unexpected from someone like her. Harper never talked back. She never raised her voice. She had been raised with discipline, but also with strong values: respect, humility, and self-control. Her father, a decorated veteran, was a quiet man with solid principles who always taught her that dignity isn't proven by shouting, but by enduring. And even when Harper came home upset about what was happening, she chose to stay quiet. She didn't want to worry her parents, let alone seem weak. That day, just before the bell for recess, the teacher stopped by her desk again. She looked directly at Harper's wrist and, without changing her tone, mentioned that colorful accessories weren't allowed at school. It was a direct reference to the red and black bracelet she always wore, a small braided band her father had made years ago, back when he was still active duty, and one she never took off. Harper explained that she had worn it since her first day of school and that no one had ever said anything about it. But the teacher wasn't really listening. She simply stated coldly that maybe it was time someone actually enforced the rules properly. With no choice, Harper slowly untied the bracelet, her fingers trembling slightly, and tucked it into her backpack pocket. The whole thing took just a few seconds, but inside her it felt like an eternity. Around her, the classroom stayed completely silent, like everyone knew something was wrong, but were too busy pretending everything was normal to do anything about it. The bell rang. The students got up quickly, relieved to leave that room. Harper stayed sitting for a few more moments like something inside her had come apart and needed time to be put back together. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word. She just packed up her things calmly and walked out of the classroom slowly. But in that moment, something inside her broke. It wasn't exactly anger. It wasn't sadness either. It was a hard-to-name feeling, a new weight in her chest, the beginning of something she didn't fully understand yet, but already knew wouldn't be easy to carry. As the weeks went by, Harper started to realize that the uncomfortable moments hadn't been random or isolated. They formed a quiet pattern, getting clearer over time, like there was a hidden intention behind every gesture, every seemingly casual remark. What at first seemed like just moments of excessive strictness soon started to feel more personal, as if Harper's very presence in the classroom was an offense to a woman who hid her judgment behind the formality of her position, judgment no one else dared to question. The corrections became more frequent and more cutting. Now, even the smallest mistake was a reason for a public comment. Always wrapped in professionalism, but carrying an edge that hurt more than any openly aggressive word. Remarks like, "Some people think rules don't apply to them," or "It's easy to keep good grades when your name opens doors," started to show up way too often. They were always said loud enough for everyone to hear, disguised as general lessons, even though everyone knew exactly who they were aimed at. Harper, who used to take part in class discussions with quiet excitement, gradually stopped raising her hand. Every time she answered and got a condescending smile in return, or saw the teacher purse her lips or raise her eyebrows in disapproval, even when she was right, something inside her pulled back. It was like her voice had started to carry a weight it didn't deserve, like just being there made people uncomfortable. And little by little, she started to accept being invisible as a way to protect herself. The other students noticed. It was impossible not to. Harper, who used to look focused and engaged, now kept her head down in her notebook, her shoulders more hunched, her eyes more distant. Some classmates looked uncomfortable with the change, while others stayed quiet out of self-preservation. The whole class, in that cold, controlled environment, worked like a system that had learned to survive the tension by pretending it wasn't there. And nobody wanted to be the next one to draw attention. The worst part maybe was how Ms. Aldridge completely changed whenever she was around other adults. During staff meetings in the school hallways or when talking to parents and administrators, her demeanor was flawless. Polite smile, polished language, professional posture. She came across as a model teacher, praised for her students' performance, admired for her organization. Not a single trace of the coldness she showed Harper ever surfaced in those moments. It was like she had two versions of herself, and only the students, especially Harper, ever saw the one who came out when the classroom door closed. That double face made everything even more confusing and painful. Harper couldn't prove what she felt. There were no raised voices, no direct insults, just a constant sense of discomfort, heavy stares and comments that seemed casual, but always ended with a hint of hidden contempt. It was like walking on broken glass. She never knew exactly when the next cut would come, but she knew it would. And no matter how carefully she tried to move, the whole floor felt designed to hurt her. At home, the change in her behavior was noticeable, but subtle. She still smiled during conversations with her parents, still sat down for meals, still trained with her dad in the backyard, but her eyes looked a little less bright and her laughter felt more restrained. When they asked how school was going, she always answered with short, steady phrases, avoiding any details. She'd say everything was fine, that she just had a lot of homework, that she was tired. And for now, no one pressed her. Inside, though, Harper was carrying a growing tension, like something inside her chest was getting tighter every single day. She tried hard to believe it was just a rough patch, that if she just kept her head down and behaved, things would eventually get better. But deep down, something in her had already started to understand that this wasn't just a tough moment. It was a quiet form of persecution, an attempt to erase who she was, disguised as discipline. And even though she hadn't said a word to anyone, Harper already knew. She wasn't just being corrected, she was being diminished. Outside the walls of the school, Harper's life seemed to move at a different pace. Slower, calmer, more honest. Like she could finally breathe without being judged or corrected for every little thing. At home, she lived with her parents and younger brother, and even though their days were also filled with chores, schedules, and routines, the house carried something that the school didn't, a sense of safety. Harper's dad, A decorated veteran with years of service, was a man of few words but strong presence. He wasn't the kind to show affection through big emotional speeches, but you could feel his care in his gestures, in how steady he always was, and in the small rituals he shared with Harper, like their karate practice in the backyard on cool afternoons. In that simple space, surrounded by low trees and the distant sound of neighbors going about their day, Harper found something she seemed to lose every day at school, the reminder that she still mattered. While her dad taught her how to plant her feet, hold her balance, and breathe before each move, he wasn't just teaching technique. He was teaching focus, self-control, and patience. And Harper understood, even without him saying it out loud, that those lessons were about way more than just fighting. It was about staying whole, even when the world tried to break her into pieces, about not letting the world around her shape what lived inside her. Her mom, on the other hand, had a sharper eye, more tuned in to the subtle changes of daily life. She worked from home, kept everything running smoothly, and had a quiet kind of precision. She was the type who could sense when something was off, even when nobody said anything. Since the school year had started, she'd already noticed that Harper had grown quieter, more withdrawn. The spark in her daughter's eyes didn't shine quite as often, and her smiles took longer to appear. Still, she respected Harper's silence. She asked gentle questions, but never pushed, like she was patiently waiting for the right moment to hear whatever Harper wasn't ready to say just yet. On weekends, when they were all together, Harper allowed herself to just be a 13-year-old girl. She helped take care of her brother, watched movies with her parents, made simple desserts, and laughed at her dad's old army stories, ones he had told a dozen times before. In those moments, everything felt normal, like nothing bad was happening outside. But as soon as Sunday night rolled around, or when it was time to pack her backpack for another school week, the weight came back and settled quietly in her chest. The contrast between school and home was getting harder to ignore. In the classroom, she shrank into herself, almost begging to be invisible. She walked softly, spoke only when absolutely necessary, avoided her teacher's eyes like someone trying to dodge a storm about to hit. But at home, she walked barefoot across the yard, laughed with her brother, lifted her chin during training with her dad. It was like she was living in two worlds that didn't connect, two places that didn't match, two versions of herself in constant conflict. And still, she didn't say anything. She kept believing she could handle it on her own, like enduring it was part of some invisible mission that no one had given her, but she had taken on herself. Maybe out of pride, maybe out of fear, maybe because she didn't want to bring into her home a pain she couldn't even fully explain yet. She didn't want to be a problem. She didn't want her parents to worry, or for her dad to feel like his daughter was being disrespected, especially when he had always taught her about strength, about respect, about dignity. She felt like if she opened up that wound, it would be like admitting weakness, and for her that was almost unforgivable. So every morning, she'd put on her backpack, fix her uniform in front of the mirror, force a small smile for her mom, and head out the door. Out there, she'd face that cold classroom again, those sharp looks, that tightly controlled voice from the teacher. And in here, inside herself, she'd hold on to the memory of who she really was. Because despite the silence, despite the hidden pain, Harper still believed there was a place inside her no one could touch, a place she had to protect. That afternoon, the sunlight was still casting soft shadows on the classroom floor when the last students started packing up their things, eager to head out for recess. The mood was the same as always, stuffy, quiet, heavy, with a kind of tension no one talked about but everyone felt. Harper, like she always did, was quietly putting her notebooks away, eyes down, her movements careful so she wouldn't draw attention. She was just about to stand up when she heard the teacher say she needed to stay a little longer. They had to talk about something related to the dress code. The sentence was spoken casually, like it was just part of school protocol. No shift in tone, no sharper look than usual. None of the other kids thought much of it. A few gave curious glances, but they filed out of the room quickly, leaving Harper alone with the teacher. The sound of the door closing behind the last student felt louder than it should have. The silence that followed felt different, thicker, colder, emptier. Aldridge went on sorting through some papers for a few seconds without saying anything, like she was carefully timing things, controlling every movement, every breath. Harper stood still next to her desk, her body stiff, like she already knew something wasn't right, even if she couldn't quite tell what was coming. Then the teacher slowly walked over to her, eyes scanning every detail of her posture, and finally said, in the same neutral tone she always used, that the length of Harper's hair wasn't in line with the school's appearance standards. There was no direct accusation, no raised voice, just the flat statement that her hairstyle was supposedly too much and might be a distraction for her or for others. Harper tried to explain. She said she'd worn her hair like that since the first day of school, that no one had ever said anything before, that it was just part of who she was. But the teacher didn't seem to hear. She didn't respond, didn't show surprise or even the slightest bit of consideration. She just turned calmly to her desk, opened one of the drawers, and, almost too precisely, pulled out a pair of straight-edged scissors, the kind usually used to cut posters or trim paper. It was in that moment, with that silent, unexpected gesture, that Harper felt the air drain from the room. There was no warning, no clear instruction. The teacher simply gripped the scissors, walked back over, stood directly in front of her, and in a move that was as cold as it was deliberate, grabbed a lock of Harper's hair with one hand, and with the other, cut it off without hesitation. The sound of the cut wasn't loud, but inside Harper's head, it echoed like something permanent. She couldn't move. She just froze. Her eyes locked on some random spot on the floor, her whole body completely paralyzed by a mix of shock, fear, and shame. The lock of hair fell slowly, sliding down her shoulders until it hit the floor, like it was symbolically marking the breaking of some invisible boundary. The teacher, acting like it was just some routine administrative task, justified what she did by saying it was necessary to maintain order, for the good of the class, to show that the rules applied to everyone equally. She spoke with a calmness that made the whole thing even more cruel, like she wasn't aware of the weight of what she had just done. Or worse, like she knew exactly what it meant. Harper didn't say a word. Her eyes started to burn, but she refused to let a single tear fall. She just stood there, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to process how something so personal, something so tied to who she was, had been taken from her like it was nothing. When the teacher finally told her she could leave, Harper quietly picked up her backpack and walked out of the room without looking back. With every step down the hallway, the sound of that cut kept replaying in her mind. And more than the hair that had fallen, what weighed on her now was the feeling that a piece of who she was had been left on that classroom floor, discarded like it didn't matter at all. That day, Harper got home earlier than usual, but she didn't say a word. She closed the door gently, walked down the hallway in silence, and went up the stairs with steps so light they were barely noticeable. Her hair, which was usually tied up neatly in a bun or a clean braid, was now sloppily thrown together, like she had pulled it back in a hurry with shaky hands, just to hide something. She avoided looking at her parents, turned her face away when she passed her mom in the kitchen, and kept the hood of her sweatshirt over her head for as long as she could. At dinner, even with the familiar smell of freshly made food and the warm tone of her little brother trying to start a conversation, Harper stayed quiet and distant, staring at her plate, pretending to listen, pretending to eat. Her mom, always tuned in to the little changes, noticed a new kind of stiffness in her daughter's body, a tension in her shoulders that didn't match the usual routine at home. She tried gently to break the ice with a few light questions, but the answers were just empty words and a mechanical smile, like Harper was physically there, but her mind was miles away. Her dad, on the other hand, didn't need an explanation to know something was wrong. A man who had learned to spot threats before they fully formed, he noticed the kinds of things others missed, how his daughter avoided eye contact, how she subtly shrank back when someone addressed her, how just sitting at the table seemed to make her uncomfortable. So he waited. And when he saw Harper suddenly stand up, trying to escape the room under the excuse of heading to her room, he knew it was time to step in. He didn't raise his voice. He just said her name in a tone that didn't leave room for running away. It made her stop right there on the stairs, frozen in place, like the sound of that calm but commanding voice alone was enough to break down the walls she'd been holding up since she left school. Harper stood still, her shoulders trembling slightly, and then slowly turned around to face him. Her hands were still shaking when she pulled out the loose hair tie that barely held her hair together, and in a small, quiet motion, she let it fall over her shoulders. But what fell wasn't the usual image of her. It was uneven, choppy, with strands at different lengths and gaps where there used to be clean symmetry. More than anything, it was a picture of violence. Not physical, but symbolic, emotional, a raw display of vulnerability no child should ever be forced to carry. She didn't cry. She just looked up and started talking, her voice shaky but without hesitation, laying out every detail of what had happened. She told him about being told to stay after class, about the accusation regarding her hair length, about the drawer being opened, the scissors being pulled out, and that strand being cut right in front of her eyes without any warning, without permission, like she didn't even have the right to say no. She talked about the absurd excuse of rules and discipline, the cold floor of the classroom, and the way she walked out alone, holding the strands in her hands like she could somehow put them back together. Her dad listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask for more details. He didn't try to spin it or soften anything. He just listened, like every word his daughter spoke was a piece of something he had to gather up carefully so it wouldn't break even more. His face, calm as ever, held something deep, an unwavering strength that didn't come from sudden anger but from a deeper conviction, the kind that comes from the instinct to protect before anything else. When she finished, he stayed silent for a few seconds. And that silence, more than any outburst, said it all. There were no doubts. No room left for excuses. Then, with the same calm he'd once used in high-pressure moments during wartime, he got up, walked to the office at the end of the hallway, and started moving. He gathered documents, made calls to names he had in old notebooks, tracked down contacts, collected evidence, laid out questions. There was no yelling, just surgical precision, like he already knew exactly what the next move had to be. Because at that moment, he understood this wasn't just about hair. It wasn't just about rules. It was about his daughter's right to be respected, and no one, absolutely no one, had the right to take that from her. The next morning, Harper's dad was up before the sun, just like he used to do back in his service days. But that day, every move he made had a different purpose. Without making a sound, he brewed coffee, reviewed his notes, confirmed names and times. His face carried the same expression he used in critical situations. Focused, methodical, not just aiming to solve a problem, but to make sure it would never happen again. To him, this wasn't just a mistake made by an educator. It was a crossing of boundaries, an institutional failure, a silent and calculated act of violence committed against his daughter, and by extension, against any child who could ever face something like that. That same morning, he reached out to the school. He didn't ask. He demanded a meeting with the principal, the school board, parent representatives, and every administrator involved in running that institution. His voice, calm as always, left no room for doubt. He wasn't asking for an explanation. He was calling for accountability. While the school tried to pull things together, an unexpected piece of news started making its way through the hallways and student group chats. One of Harper's classmates, who'd been among the last to leave the room that day, had, out of instinct or suspicion, started recording discreetly with her phone before walking out the door. The video, though short, was clear and undeniable. It showed the teacher walking up to Harper with scissors in hand, cutting her hair without permission, and at one point saying loud and clear that certain students needed to learn they weren't special. It didn't take long for the video to spread. Students saw it, parents saw it, and once it made its way to the school administration, there was no way to ignore it. What could have easily been denied or twisted had now become hard proof, a visual and audio confirmation of behavior many had quietly suspected, but that was now exposed in a way no one could argue with. The meeting, scheduled for the same day, was held in the school auditorium. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and a quiet tension hung in the air from the very first minute. Harper, sitting between her parents, kept her eyes down, her short hair neatly tied back, like someone trying to at least piece together what had been broken. Around her, adults whispered, avoided direct eye contact, but the atmosphere was heavy with expectation, not for what would be said, but for what could no longer be avoided. When it was his turn to speak, Harper's father didn't raise his voice, didn't use harsh words, and didn't let anger take over. Instead, with clarity and firmness, he laid out, step by step, everything his daughter had been through over the past few months. He exposed the pattern of mistreatment, the slow construction of a hostile environment, the microaggressions disguised as discipline, the public comments, the constant humiliation. He made sure not only to mention the haircut, but to frame it as the climax of a carefully orchestrated series of abuses. The recording was presented next. The video played in total silence. There was no more room for interpretation, the sound of the scissors cutting, the teacher's voice saying Harper wasn't different from anyone else, the coldness of the act. It was all right there, in front of people who no longer had the option of looking away. Aldridge, present at the meeting, tried to defend herself with speeches about order, equality, and the importance of rules. She spoke of her intentions to maintain discipline, her views on the school's role, but the truth was already out in the open. And what might have once been mistaken for strictness or structure was now clearly seen as control, arrogance, and abuse of power. The decision didn't take long. After conferring with members of the administration and school board, the immediate dismissal of the teacher was announced publicly. A formal apology was read aloud by the academic coordinator, directed to Harper and her family, acknowledging the school's failure, its negligence in identifying the behavioral pattern, and its commitment to review protocols to make sure no other student would ever have to go through the same thing. For Harper, that moment didn't bring instant relief. The pain was still there. The scars weren't erased by a formal apology, and her trust wasn't restored by an official statement. But there was a beginning, a confirmation that she hadn't been wrong, hadn't overreacted, hadn't made it up, and more importantly, there was now a clear sign that the silence surrounding her had finally been broken. After the meeting that led to the teacher's dismissal and the public exposure of something that had been kept quiet for so long, Harper spent a few days at home, surrounded by a strange kind of time, filled with stillness and reflection. It was as if reality was still trying to reorganize itself around her. Things had changed. There was no denying that. But inside, the feeling of vulnerability hadn't completely gone away. It was like something in her was still bracing for the next blow, even knowing it might not come anymore. The school principal, in touch with her parents, even offered the family the possibility of an extended leave, suggesting it might be better for Harper to stay away for a while until things settled down. But Harper herself turned it down. Not with firm words or grand declarations, just with the quiet conviction of someone who knows, deep down, that running away wasn't an option. She knew that if she didn't go back now, if she waited too long, she might lose what little space she still had there. And she didn't just want to move on. She wanted to go back and take back what they had tried to take from her. The morning she returned to school, the sky was clear and sunlight was coming through the windows of the house with an unusual softness. Harper put on her uniform slowly, tying back her short hair with care like someone preparing for a ritual. Her hair, now straighter and more even, had been trimmed by a professional in the days following what had happened, but there was still a trace of past violence in it, a visible reminder that something there had been broken. Even so, when she looked in the mirror, Harper didn't look away. She held her reflection for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and left the room. Her father drove her to school. On the way, few words were spoken. But between them, there was a quiet exchange of strength, a kind of bond that went beyond words. When they arrived, he didn't park right at the gate like he used to. He stopped a little further away, giving her that moment to herself. The walk to the entrance, the crossing of stairs, the reunion with that space that had once been a source of fear and discomfort. He stood there, watching from a distance, body steady and eyes alert, like someone who still watches over her, but now trusts. When she walked into the school, Harper felt the eyes on her. They weren't the same as before. Now they carried a new kind of weight. Curiosity, maybe, or even guilt. Some people quickly looked away, others followed her carefully with their eyes. She heard whispers in the distance, felt words floating around her name, but she didn't let it shake her. She walked with steady steps, head held high, face calm. There was something different in her presence, like for the first time in a long while, she stood in that space, fully aware of who she was. The teachers, now clearly more attentive, greeted her more carefully, not with pity, but with respect. Some students, who had previously avoided getting close for fear of becoming targets themselves, started to come back around. A wave in the hallway, a shy comment in class, an invitation to sit together at lunch. But enough to show that she wasn't alone anymore. At the end of the day, as she walked out through the same school gates she had passed in silence so many times before, she saw her mom waiting on the other side of the street. The hug was long, warm, and in it, Harper allowed herself, for the first time since everything had happened, to feel something close to lightness. Not because everything was fixed, but because in that moment, there was a sense that she had made it back. And that in itself was an act of courage. In the days that followed, school life went on as usual, with tests, assignments, hallway chatter, and end-of-semester plans. But for Harper, every day lived with a sense of normalcy felt like a victory. Little by little, she was finding joy again in participating in class, raising her hand with confidence, smiling without hesitation. The spaces that once felt hostile were slowly becoming places of belonging again. And in that quiet and steady process of rebuilding, Harper was reconnecting with the part of herself that had been pushed down. She wasn't the same girl she was before, but in a way, she was becoming who she had always been. Only now, more aware of her own strength, the calendar moved forward quietly, the way it always does when life insists on going on even while people are still trying to figure out how they feel. The weeks passed at an almost gentle pace, and the school environment, once full of tension and constant watchfulness, now seemed wrapped in a new layer of care and awareness. But for Harper, her inner world was still filled with questions that didn't have immediate answers. Some days she felt strong. Other days, the sound of the scissors cutting her hair still echoed inside her chest. It was on one of those days, as she walked through the school gym hallway, that she noticed the poster taped next to the entrance of the court, the same colorful sheet that was put up every year around that time, announcing the traditional karate tournament held at the end of the semester. She stood there for a few seconds in front of the wall, looking at the paper like someone looking into a mirror. She recognized that symbol. That event had always been a milestone for her, not because of the competition itself, but because of the meaning it carried. It was the moment when all the training with her dad, all those afternoons in the backyard under the sun or in the drizzle, every fall and every correction, turned into something more. For a moment, she thought about not signing up. The idea of putting herself out there, of stepping onto a mat in front of so many people after everything she had been through, felt scary. But there was something inside her, something subtle but steady, that told her maybe she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. That maybe the tournament wasn't about winning or showing strength to others, but about reminding herself that she was still here, that what they tried to take from her still existed. That night, without making a big deal out of it, she mentioned to her dad that she was thinking of signing up, and he, with the same calmness as always, just nodded, without saying more than he had to, like he already knew this moment would come. In the days that followed, the training sessions picked up, but there was something different about them. There was no rush, no pressure, not even an expectation of victory. There was only commitment, a reconnection between father and daughter through movement, through steady breathing, through full attention to the present moment. Harper felt like she wasn't training to defeat opponents, but to rebuild a space inside her that had been shaken. Every strike, every dodge, every steady stance felt like a reaffirmation of her identity, not as the daughter of a veteran or a student marked by a school scandal, but as someone who had gone through something brutal, silent, and unfair, and still chose to keep going without hiding. On the day of the tournament, the school was busier than usual. Parents, students, and teachers filled the bleachers in the gym, and the sound of voices mixed with the squeaking of sneakers on the polished floor. Harper got there early, wearing the same white uniform as always, her belt tied tight around her waist, her short hair brushed back, not hiding the marks of everything she'd been through. She walked to the warm-up area with steady but calm steps. She looked straight ahead. She wasn't looking for recognition in anyone's eyes. She just wanted to feel whole. When it was her turn, she stepped onto the mat with the calm of someone who knew the most important fight had already happened long before that moment. Her opponent was strong. The moves were fast. But Harper stayed steady, grounded, connected to her breath, her focus, and the memory of every lesson her dad had ever taught her. She fought without hesitation, and she won. But the win, even though it was real, wasn't what truly mattered. What filled her chest at the end as she bowed with respect was something else. It was the feeling of having taken back something she thought she had lost. It was the certainty that even though she'd been changed, even though she'd been marked, she was still herself, and maybe even stronger than before. When she stepped off the mat, her dad was standing there, arms crossed, eyes steady. He didn't cheer loudly or shout words of pride, but when she walked up to him, he looked her in the eyes and said, with the calm of someone who doesn't hand out praise lightly, but only when it's real, that he was proud. Not because she'd won, but because she didn't give up. Harper didn't say anything. She just nodded with a small smile, because in that moment, she knew. The scar was still there, visible, tender, stubborn, but it wasn't a wound anymore. It was a mark of strength. Time went by. Not fast, not slow. just at the exact pace of someone who needs to heal on the inside before showing the world they're ready to move forward. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly started happening again in its quiet, ordinary way, made up of little routines, hallway laughter, scribbled notebooks, and steps that no longer hesitated when crossing through the school gates. That night, alone in her room, Harper stood in front of the mirror for a few minutes. The reflection looking back at her was an image that, little by little, had stopped making her uncomfortable. Her hair, which had once been cut so violently, was now growing back slowly, taking on a new shape. It was still short, still held memories, but now she could see beauty in it, not out of vanity, but because in that hair, now growing in again, she also saw herself rebuilding. She ran her fingers through the strands, feeling the texture, looking at the ends and the lines, and realized with a quiet kind of calm that she liked the way it looked. It was different. It stood out. It was hers, not by choice at first, but now by decision. Because there was something symbolic in that cut, something that made it clear that no matter how hard they'd tried to strip her of herself, she was still here. In the stillness of her room, there were no outside voices, no judgment, no curious looks, just her inner voice, steady and soft, that for the first time in a long time was coming through clearly again. And that voice didn't talk about appearance or rules or authority. It didn't bring up her last name or what had been done to it. It didn't carry the image of her dad or the weight of the respect he commanded. The voice said something else. It said that none of this had ever been about fame or position or being worthy. It had always been about staying on your feet, about not letting yourself be erased by people who never really saw you, about refusing to settle into the role of the victim and still allowing yourself to feel the pain, about being afraid but not letting that fear stop you, about hearing voices that hurt and still holding on to a voice inside you that comforts. It was about learning that real strength doesn't yell, doesn't force, doesn't crush. Strength, she realized, is choosing to stay kind even after people have been cruel to you. It's knowing that scars don't define who you are, but they do remind you of everything you've made it through. Now, everything she had been through felt both far away and close at the same time. The classroom where she was silenced, the teacher's cold stare, the moment she felt that strand of hair fall, and with it, her confidence. All of it still lived inside her, but it didn't hurt the same way anymore. Because now there were other memories taking up space. There was the day she returned to school, the steady steps through whispers. There were the training sessions with her dad, the way discipline had become a path to healing. There was the tournament, the precise moves, the win that wasn't about the score, but about herself. And most of all, there was the certainty that through all of it, she had learned to recognize herself, not as the daughter of someone admired, not as a victim of a system that failed, but as someone who fell and chose to get back up. The reflection in the mirror stared back at her, and this time she held the gaze without looking away. Her face was still the same. Soft features, young skin, sharp eyes, but there was something new there. A quiet strength, a kind of maturity that no one asks for, but life demands. She stepped away from the mirror, walked over to the window, and looked up at the dark sky, scattered with stars. She felt at peace, not because everything was fixed, but because finally she had found the place from where she could start again. And for anyone who followed her journey up to this point, here's something that doesn't need to be said out loud to be felt. She wasn't special because she was the daughter of a hero. She was special because she learned to fight through her own pain and she won.